Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States by Alex Wellerstein, narrated by John Mclain. Publisher's Note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type Restricted Data into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code ATOMIC and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. Introduction: The Terrible Inhibition of the Atom. I am afraid the scientists have led us into a terrible world. General Leslie R. Groves, 1948. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the White House issued a press release that would change the world. In an instant, the existence of a vast scientific project was revealed, as well as the fruits of its labor, a new and revolutionary weapon which had destroyed Hiroshima, Japan. It is an atomic bomb, the statement explained. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. And prior to that moment of revelation, even the fact that the United States was interested in creating such a weapon, much less had actually created, tested, and now deployed it, had been top secret, the improper release of which could be, in principle, punished by death. Nuclear weapons have always been surrounded by secrecy, and the American atomic bomb was born secret. From the moment that scientists first conceived of its possibility, through the massive undertaking that was its actual creation, there were efforts to control the spread of nuclear information, including the newly discovered scientific facts that made them possible. This desire for control was born out of fear. For the first scientists working on the American atomic bomb, it was a fear of a dread enemy, Nazi Germany, using said information to build their own weapons. Later, the fears shifted, as officials worried that a premature announcement of the new weapon would lessen its psychological value against the Japanese, and potentially threaten the success of the project itself. Though this secrecy emerged from fears that were originally very specific to the context of World War II, it was easily adapted to the new fears that followed, as new enemies emerged: the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, North Korea, even non-state nuclear terrorists. And far more diffuse and varied fears would also promote this desire for control, with consequences ranging from the mundane, diplomatic difficulties, to the apocalyptic, global thermonuclear war. But from the beginning, the desire for nuclear secrecy contained contradictions and complications. The scientists who had made the bomb and had become enmeshed in its secrecy were frequently wary. Some had supported the secrecy entirely because they too shared the fears that motivated it. But many felt the secrecy, even if it had been necessary, was stifling. And as the war's end grew close, new questions and new worries entered into their minds. The atomic bomb was a product of science and industry, yet the fundamental principles it was based on were well known to scientists prior to the outbreak of war. How could a fact of nature be rendered effectively into a state secret if any scientist in any laboratory in any country could replicate and rediscover it? Military plans, conceived in the mind of a soldier, can be kept secret indefinitely. But can facts of physics and chemistry? Many scientists and policymakers further asked whether science should be kept secret at all, and whether attempting to do so could be counterproductive for security. The atomic bomb was not merely the application of science to war, but the result of decades of investment in scientific education, infrastructure, and global collaboration. Secrecy, according to many of the scientists who worked under it, stifled scientific advance. If secrecy were made the norm, Would science thrive or even survive? Which would serve the nation's security more, keeping things secret or racing forward as fast and as openly as possible? And the same science that followed for the creation of nuclear weapons also appeared to offer up the possibility of cheap, abundant, and clean energy generation, among other civilian benefits. Would the fears of military uses of the atom override the hopes of its peaceful applications? Secrecy had been a defining aspect of the work to create the atomic bomb, but would it be its future? The aforementioned White House press release about the Hiroshima attack toward the end addressed these questions, but left them deliberately unanswered. It has never been the habit of the scientists of this country or the policy of this government to withhold from the world scientific knowledge, it explained, and noted that under normal circumstances, everything about the work would be released. But the present circumstances of the world, one war ending, an uneasy international situation unfolding, meant that the means of producing the atomic bomb had to be kept secret, at least for now. There would be, the statement explained, further examination of the question in order to protect the nation, and indeed the rest of the world, from the danger of sudden destruction. The totalizing scientific secrecy that the atomic bomb appeared to demand was new, unusual, and very nearly unprecedented. It was foreign to both American science and American democracy, and its compatibility with either has always been an area of dispute. But the circumstances of the bomb's creation and the bomb itself seemed to mandate the period of secrecy be extended to avoid an existential risk. And that nuclear secrecy has continued, in evolving but ever-present forms, to our present day. We now find ourselves over 7 decades after the end of World War II, and some 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and nuclear weapons, nuclear secrecy, and nuclear fears show every appearance of being a permanent part of our present world, to the degree that for most it is nearly impossible to imagine it otherwise. This book is a history of nuclear secrecy in the United States, from the first moments that the atomic bomb was seen as a realistic possibility in the late 1930s, through our present moment in the early 21st century. It is the story of how a large and varied group of people, scientists, administrators, military officers, politicians, lawyers, judges, journalists, activists, and the broader public, grappled with the question of whether nuclear knowledge should be regarded as something that needed to be controlled, and how many of the fruits of their discussions, policies, and interventions shaped the American national security state that endures to this day. The singular motif that reappears throughout this work is that of tension. The bomb may have been born in secrecy, but that secrecy was always controversial and always contested. The concerns about the compatibility of science and secrecy were always joined by concerns about the compatibility of secrecy and democracy. The United States has, since its 18th century origins, enshrined Enlightenment ideals of openness and freedom of speech in its core institutions. These ideals have never been treated as absolutes, but they have come with real legal, political, and rhetorical power. In practice, this has meant that while secrecy has flourished in the post-World War II American context, it has never been unlimited in its scope, even with a threat as seemingly expansive and existential as the global development of nuclear weapons. It has also meant that secrecy reform and nuclear policy have always been in tension with democratic desires. The physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had done much to create both the weapons and their secrecy, referred to the difficulty of public deliberation as the terrible inhibition of the atom, and it was both a badge and burden to be borne by those with access to the secrets. The secrecy, many like Oppenheimer believed, ultimately contorted American policymaking and left the American public dangerously ignorant of the evolving national and world situation. These tensions between the ideals of science and secrecy on the one hand, and of desires for openness and security on the other, are what make the history of nuclear secrecy in the United States unpredictable, surprising, and at times bizarre. In one telling example, discussed at length in Chapter 3, while the United States may have been the first country to make an atomic bomb, it was also the first country to release a technical history of the atomic bomb only days after its first use, and it did so in the interest of both improving democratic discourse and preserving further secrecy. That such a document could be created at all, rendering into plain and unified discussion the work of the Manhattan Project that had been previously enshrouded with code words and a need-to-know compartmentalization, is strange enough by itself, and no other country has done anything similar since. But that the top scientific, military, and political representatives on the project would all agree to its utility and lobby to the president personally for its release only days after the Nagasaki attack is a remarkable example of the ways in which secrecy and revelation are not only paired, but can serve many different ideologies and institutional goals. This book takes as its subject the people and institutions that had as their goal the realization of nuclear secrecy in the world, the means by which they attempted to make the ideal of secrecy real so that some people knew the secret and others did not, the contexts in which they operated and its influence on their thought and action, and the people who challenged, critiqued, and attempted to reform, undo, or subvert these efforts. It is a history of both the creation of nuclear secrecy as well as the resistances to it, because they have always gone together. And it is also a history of information release as well as containment, for these two actions were, as we will see, frequently two sides of the same coin. It is not a story of the triumph of nuclear secrecy, nor of the triumph of openness. Rather, it is a messy story, with few clear winners and losers, or heroes or villains. The same people trying to create the new secrecy were also concerned with its ill effects and with the demands of democracy. Within the institutions that were meant to enforce secrecy, deep debates about the nature, purpose, and means of secrecy were frequently taking place, and reform of the secrecy system has been a goal nearly since it was created. And outside of the national security apparatus were the vast, uncontainable multitudes of the American public, whose willingness to trust that government attempts to control information were done in good faith declined over the course of the 20th century. The specificity of the American context matters. The contradictions of secrecy that American scientists and policymakers wrestled with were far less of a concern for totalitarian nations, where, unsurprisingly, state security took full precedence. Even the other democratic nations with nuclear weapons seem less deeply conflicted than the Americans. Their governmental and social structures seem to accommodate nuclear secrecy far more easily. It is not just that the U.S. has had a hard time finding balance between its various ideals. It is that it has not been able to imagine what that balance would look like. Nuclear secrecy may have become deeply embedded in the United States, but it has always been an uncomfortable and often regretted arrangement. Nuclear secrecy does not refer to a single goal, practice, or institution. The English word secret is derived from the Latin secretus, meaning to cut, to sunder, to separate. Knowledge, however, is ephemeral and immaterial unless it is instantiated in some physical way into the world, whether as something that exists in people's heads, written onto paper, or embedded into some material technology, to pick just a few possibilities. Secrecy is the desire for a cutting out of knowledge from the world, and making that desire into a reality involves very real acts of cutting up society, allowing some people to pass through certain doors rather than others, for example. Sometimes this cutting action is quite literal, such as when a redactor slices out secret lines from a text with a razor, as happened in the past. Today they use software for this. So nuclear secrecy began as a fearful desire, but turning that desire into a reality required the work of thousands of people. Over time, the motivations and justifications for secrecy have changed, as have the various practices and means for enacting that secrecy in the world, as have the institutions and agencies tasked with articulating the motivations and cultivating the practices. While not monolithic, we can regard nuclear secrecy as a regime, as a bundle of thoughts, activities, and organizations that try to make secrecy real in the world, to perform the multitude of acts of epistemological slicing that result in some people knowing things and other people not. The American nuclear secrecy regime has evolved several times from its emergence in the late 1930s through our present moment in the early 21st century. Each chapter of this book explores a key shift in how nuclear secrecy was conceived of, made real in the world, and challenged. Roughly speaking, one can divide the history of American nuclear secrecy into three major parts: the birth of nuclear secrecy, the solidification of the Cold War nuclear secrecy regime, and the challenges to the regime that began in the late Cold War and continue into the present. Part 1, chapters 1 through 3, narrates the origins of nuclear secrecy in the context of World War II. This was a secrecy initially created as an informal self-censorship campaign run by a small band of refugee nuclear physicists who feared that any publicized research into the new phenomena of nuclear fission would spark a weapons program in Nazi Germany. As the possibility of nuclear weapons becoming a reality grew and official government interest increased, this informal approach was transmuted into something more rigid, but still largely run by scientists. A secrecy of scientist administrators created by Vannevar Bush and James Conant, two powerful wartime scientists that gradually put in place a wide variety of secrecy practices surrounding the weapons. When the work was put into the hands of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and became the Manhattan Project, these efforts expanded exponentially as the project grew into a virtual empire. And for all of the difficulty of attempting to control a workforce in the hundreds of thousands, the thorniest questions would come when these scientific, military, and civilian administrators tried to contemplate how they would balance the needs for publicity with the desires of secrecy as they planned to use their newfound weapon in war. Part 2, chapters 4 through 6, looks at this wartime secrecy regime as it was transformed from what was largely considered a temporary and expedient program into something more permanent and lasting. Out of late wartime and post-war debates about the problem of secrecy, a new system emerged centered on the newly created Atomic Energy Commission and restricted data, a novel and unusually expansive legal category that applied only to nuclear secrets. This initial approach was characterized by a continued sense that it needed reform and liberalization, but these efforts were dashed by three terrific shocks at the end of the decade: the first Soviet atomic bomb test, the hydrogen bomb debate, and the revelation of Soviet atomic espionage. In the wake of these events, which reinforced the idea of a totemic secret of the bomb, while at the same time emphasizing a nuclear American vulnerability, a new bipolar approach to secrecy emerged. This Cold War regime simultaneously held that to release an atomic secret inappropriately was to suffer consequences as extreme as death, but that once atomic information had been deemed safe, and perhaps profitable, it ought to be distributed as widely as possible. Part 3, chapters 7 through 9, chronicles the troubles that this new Cold War mindset about secrecy encountered from the 1960s through the present. Many of these were problems of its own making, embodying both the extremes of constraint and release, The Cold War approach to nuclear secrecy fundamentally rested on the dubious assertion that the technology it governed could be divided into simple categories of safety and danger, despite its inherently dual-use nature. These inherent conflicts were amplified by the rise of a powerful anti-secrecy politics in the 1970s, which motivated a wide spectrum of people, ranging from nuclear weapons designers to college students and anti-war activists, to attempt to dismantle the system in whole or in part. The end of the Cold War brought only brief respite, as initial efforts to reform the system faltered in the face of partisan politics and new fears from abroad. Clearly, this is a work of history. I am a professional historian. This means that I traffic primarily in archival sources, citations to which you will find in the endnotes of this book. I have been sometimes asked, how can you write the history of something that is still at least partially secret, much less the secret history of secrecy itself? Wouldn't you need a security clearance to do this correctly? And wouldn't the true history of nuclear secrecy be something that could not be published without endangering national and global security? And even if you can write something about this history, wouldn't the fact that so much is missing make it a paltry offering and likely to contain falsehoods and omissions? It is worth noting that while much about the history of U.S. nuclear weapons is still secret, there is an impressive amount that is not. The same forces that created the aforementioned tensions around nuclear secrecy have resulted in a system that over sometimes very long periods of time results in a lot of information being eventually released. This is often the case for documents that are not about the weapons per se, but are about the governance of the weapons. So, as the voluminous endnotes will attest, there is actually a great deal of information available relating to how secrecy was imagined, implemented, and debated internally. And there is more information on even weapons topics declassified than most people are aware of, and this book, in part, describes how that came to be, sometimes officially, sometimes not. Ironically, as the official Atomic Energy Commission historian Richard G. Hewlett pointed out decades ago, the secrecy system actually makes some aspects of this history easier, because it mandates, with severe legal consequences, the preservation of documents that might otherwise have been thrown away, lost, or taken as a souvenir. That doesn't mean that the government will let you look at them, of course. But there are gaps in our knowledge, and always will be. Archival sources never tell the full story, because not everything is written down, not everything written down is complete, and not everything written down is truthful. People who work on relatively recent history can sometimes supplement their work with discussions with historical participants, though these come with their own problems, such as bad memories, historical grudges, and the living being privileged over the dead. There will always be gaps. This is the case even with history that was not of formerly classified subjects. In the case of once secret documents, those gaps are sometimes quite literal. A gap will suddenly appear in a sentence, sometimes identified with a deleted stamp, sometimes not. This is the work of the censor, who has sanitized the document, removing whatever information they thought would still compromise security, as defined in a guide they have in front of them. The history of these guides is part of the history of secrecy and emerged in the wake of the Manhattan Project. At times, I have used the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, to get access to documents that had not yet made their way into archives, but this law compels the censor only to review, not to release. It cannot let one access information the government still determines should be kept secret, and Congress has given the government a lot of latitude in making that determination. Despite the limitations inherent in trying to write history with an often heavily redacted archival record, I have never sought nor desired an official security clearance. This, no doubt, leaves many additional gaps in the story, but it also allows me to share what I have found with impunity. This is a trade-off any scholar who works on formerly or currently classified subject matter knows well. Even having a clearance does not guarantee that one will see everything one desires, and introduces potentially mammoth difficulties in the publication process, giving government agencies the ability to modify or even veto the text. None of that seemed worth it to me. I have interacted with historians who have had clearances, and for everyone who was smug that it gave them a special advantage over those without one, an attitude that I am dubious of, as a clearance can lead to an overestimation of the value of secret knowledge, there were others who admitted that it gave them more grief than deep understanding. For me, it ultimately comes down to my aims as a historian. If I can't tell anyone what I know, what's the point in knowing it? I'd rather risk errors, which is easy enough even with a clearance, than be muzzled. All historians deal with gaps in the historical record, whether caused by water damage, the fires of a war, ill-advised document destruction, or the fact that most of human experience, even in our hyper-documented modern age, is not preserved in a record. What makes secrecy feel different is its intentionality. The information I may want is actually knowable and may even be known, but just not by me, at least right now, which is frustrating. But there is also a logic to secrecy. The information that is kept secret generally falls into categories of justification, like national security, and so the question becomes, is the information that I care about also information that the censor thinks should be censored? In some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. The history of secrecy itself is not always still secret. There are places where it intersects with present-day security concerns. For example, discussions about the secrecy of the design of the hydrogen bomb can involve details about said design of the hydrogen bomb. But there are also many places where it does not. I do not want one to take a dim view of the censor, and I use the term here very much tongue-in-cheek. The censors are people too, often doing their job with great pride and sensitivity, though as people they do err. While this book is definitely not a justification or even rationalization of the secrecy regimes that exist, I do mean for it to be a partial resurrection of the censors and their points of view, because their perspectives are frequently obliterated by the same practices of secrecy that they participated in. As a result, their motives and goals are often only inferred by those on the outside, frequently their critics, and so it is the critic's view of the censor that dominates much writing and understanding of secrecy. We can't be neutral toward secrecy, any more than we can be neutral toward the idea of state power in general. But to understand how it works, we must understand it from the perspective of the systems that produce it, as well as those of its inherently more vocal critics. In this book I have attempted to flesh out and historicize both perspectives, which I suspect may be frustrating to individuals who identify primarily with one or the other. For all the frustrations involved in working with formerly classified sources, the historian has a major advantage over the people who were living through this history as it unfolded, even those with clearances. Time. The secrecy regime in the U.S. was largely set up to erode over time, and even in areas where the erosion was not intended, it occurred. This applies across agencies, though not always equally, and subject matter, though nuclear weapon secrets do not erode automatically, unlike some areas of government activity. The consequence is that I have sometimes had access to a much wider variety of formerly classified information than anyone living in, say, the 1950s might have had, even those with the top security clearances, because their access was typically compartmentalized. Thanks to declassification actions and the judicious use of the Freedom of Information Act, we can reconstruct the partial archives of multiple agencies and governmental bodies at once, where a historical actor would have likely been limited to one or perhaps two of these files. If something is declassified, I no longer require any need to know it. I also have access to private journals, correspondence, and sometimes the recorded recollections of my historical sources. So the situation, as tough as the presence of redactions might make it...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?